Very good afternoon, students. Students, can you hear me? Yeah, today we are going to discuss few things about G.M. Hopkins' poem. Students, am I very clear to you? Am I audible? Students, am I audible to you? Today we shall discuss few things about G.M. Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins' poems are there for your syllabus, for your study. And today we will be dealing with G.M. Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins was born in the year 1844, July 28th, and major themes of his poems are
Sorry, students, technical issue. Sorry, students, technical issue. So today we shall be discussing few important things and important poems about James Hopkins. James Hopkins poems are prescribed for your exams, and a few poems are there like God's Granger, Windover, Pale Beauty, Thou art indeed just a Lord. These are the few poems are there, and I am here to discuss few important things, the themes on which G.M. Hopkins has written the poem. And this particular author belongs to Victorian period. Major themes in his poems are nature and religion. And G.M. Hopkins is generally regarded as the innovator of the modern verse in English. We can find a strong element of Christian sensibility. And he is a priest, is a Jesuit, and founded by Ignatius Loyola. And he wanted to be a priest and became a priest, and he joined SJ, that is Society of Jesus. And being a priest, he wanted to write few things, and he is confused about his life, what to do, how to lead his life, whether to be a poet or concentrate on his religious aspects. So during the Lent season, that appears to be the 40 days in the Christian era, that's where Christians fast during the Lent season, and he completely gave up writing. And later he started his poetry, and more majority of the poems which he has written is published by his friend after his death. And this particular poem was published, God's Granger was published after his death, and it was written in 1877. God's Granger, let us look into the poem. God's Granger is a hymn to the greatness of God. The poem expresses Hopkins' concern for preserving nature. The poem shows that Hopkins is a lover of nature, and he may be described as an environmentalist. So let us quickly go through a few of the lines there. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, and is flame out like the shining sugar foil. It gathers to the greatness like the ooze of oil. In the poem, God's Granger, Hopkins, the poet, tries to tell us that the world is filled to the brim with God's glory and splendor. God's glory manifests itself in two ways. It flames out with sudden brilliance, as when a silver foil is shaken and gives out the glints of light. And it tells that the whole nature is filled with God's presence, God's glory. So man has to see how God's presence is felt everywhere in nature. It is noteworthy in connection with God's Granger, which is the subject of the sonnet, that Hopkins he has made a special and exhaustive study of Ignatius Loyola in his spiritual book. And he tells that being a priest poet, he has written about the God's presence. God's work versus men's work. So man is not in a good position to see the presence of God, and he has completely lost in his own world. Man has created his own beauty. God, man is not in a position to see the God's presence. So to illustrate few examples there, it tells because of ego, man has forgotten to receive God. And he tries to tell us that the world has completely changed and is become suitable for men. That's called men's world versus God's world. God has created all the people. God has created the people to live in his paradise, but is not in a position to see and is not in a position to seek the blessings of God. And there again, crushed, the word crushed. Why do men then now not tread his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod. And you have to give specific importance to this particular line. Generations have trod, have trod, have trod. Through these lines, the poet asks why people no longer heed God's rod or recognize just the punishment of God. The divine rod, both it heals the sinners as well. It heals the sinners as well because man is lost himself in the world created by him, but he is completely deviating himself from the presence of God. That's what he tells. People's sense have grown dull, both to pain to his cause. Life has become a monotonous and very routine for them. So they have lost completely in their own world. They are not in a position to seek the presence of God. And God, and here the author is trying to tell us that God's presence is felt everywhere, but man is the one who's destroying everything. The nature, Mother Nature, has given us many things in our lives, but when we look into all the different aspects of life, man has lost his interest in seeking God. That's what generations have trod. Generations have trod. That means all the generations are doing the same thing. And Hopkins is generally specifying the people to accept God, and move in his own path. And he's telling nature doesn't change. It seems superficial. Deep within, the nature itself remains evergreen. Maybe every year the trees shed their leaves and gain new life. The same way here, author is trying to tell us that people completely deviate themselves from God. But God's presence should be felt by each and every one. So this particular poem clearly tells us how we can see the presence of God. Let us move on to quickly. Let us move on to the thematical aspects. Why the poet is trying to tell us God's grandeur? Because he is a great believer of God. He is a priest, as I told you before. He is a Jesuits priest, Society of Jesus. Is a religious congregation founded by Ignatius Loyola. And being a priest, he had the passion to write about Christ. He had the passion to write about Christ. That is the only reason why he wanted to tell the people to accept God. The presence, the glory of God should be felt by the people. People should not lose their lives in constructing their houses, their homes, leading their own life. Remember, God, our life on this earth is not permanent. We are in a rented house. The earth is called a rented house. But we may have to vacate one day. We may have to go to heaven. That is the only reason why G.M. Hopkins specifically telling us to obey the presence of God, to accept God as the Savior. That is the only reason why Christ has sacrificed his own life on the cross. He has shed his blood because of every sin of mankind. And he's telling to accept God and move forward with nature. And man should not create anything anything which is unwanted for the nature. And he just tells us that to move forward by the glory of God. This is one thing, God's grandeur. And next thing is here, I'm going to read out few things why G.M. Hopkins trying to give up his writing. He writes in his own diary, what I have written, I burnt before I became a Jesuit, and I resolved to write no more as not belonging to my profession, unless it were by the wish of one of my superiors. So for 7 years, I wrote nothing except 2 or 3 little presentation of pieces which occasion called for. But then in the winter 1875, just he started writing few things. I was affected by the account of happening to say to my rector, he said that he wished somebody would write a poem on the subject. On this end, I set to work, though my hand was out at first, produced one I had wanted to hear the echo rhyme of God. And he clearly tells us he wanted to give up his writing. And when a person becomes a priest, he has to obey by the rules and regulations of the God. He has to obey by the rules and regulations of the God. The same way here, he has to obey his superiors, and he wanted to give up his writing. Later, that's the only reason why during his lifetime, none of his poems were published. He just told his friend Robert that if it is to be useful, let it be published after my death. So it was published after his death by his friend. So let us move on to the next poem, where, just a minute, Windover. This particular poem was written in 1877. Let us look into the first 8 lines of the poem, what the poem is trying to tell us. The poet has caught the sight of the falcon, who is described as the morning's favorite bird. As the dolphin or crown prince of the kingdom of daylight, the falcon is drawn from the resting place or abide by the dappled color dawn. Just it tells that is fascinated by the falcon, the bird, and by the color. The poet sees the bird as the bestring the air beneath him like a skillful horseman. Skillful horseman. As he rides high and erects like a horseman in the saddle, the bird circles in the air. It tells that the bird which has got the power to just go through the air, it just tells the bird circles around the air, around the wind, spinning like a nun's wimple in movement. At this moment of conflict with the pleasure of the wind, the bird flees an ecstasy and sweeps off in the direction of the wind through on a swing. Just imagine yourself a bird flying in the just over the sky in the wind. The bird just swings through the air and takes the aerial route. Let us see what he is trying to tell us. This triumph of the mind over the matter inward strives the art of the poet in hiding. The poet's art is thrilled with admiration of the bird, for the bird's achievement is triumphing over the inanimate force of nature. Just the poet can see many things, many optimistic things in the bird. Now, in 8 to 14 lines, in the 8 to 14 lines, in the poem Windover, the poet is trying to tell us. The poet now sums up the quality of the falcon, wrote beauty, valor act, pride. All these qualities can be seen in falcon, that bird. So the bird which has got the power to skim through the air, and he sees some optimistic qualities. Being a devotional Christian, that's what I told you before in the beginning of this class. I told you, being a priest poet, and most of his poems are in religious aspects. Most of his poems are in religious aspects. So he just sees how this bird can fly in the sky, and how the poet is fascinated, how the poet is fascinated by the beauty of that bird, how this bird takes the aerial route, and he is also fascinated by the creation of God. He tells it is creation of God. God has created the nature, and he has left the bird to live, but it all depends upon the mankind to take it in a positive way. So this poem tells us many aspects, good optimistic aspects about the bird. Let's move on to the another poem. Just 1 minute. Let us move on to the another poem where the poet is trying to tell us, yeah, thou art indeed just a Lord. This is a beautiful poem. It is a Latin epigraph taken from the Bible, Jeremiah, and it may thus translated to English: thou art indeed just, Lord. If I dispute with thee, yet what I shall see is just. Why does the way of the impious prosper? The first three lines of the poem are also the most important literal translation of the Latin epigraph. So the first three lines are translated, exactly translated from Latin. So the first four lines of the poem, the poet is willing to admit that the Lord is just, and that is any disputation, he must indeed acknowledge God's injustice, God's justice. So he's trying to tell us that he is in a position to accept God's will. And yet, a doubt has arisen in the poet's mind, and he must therefore express his doubts, which seems to him justified too. The poet then asks why it is that sinful persons thrive in this world. And he's asking a question to the readers, and he's asking the question to God: why it is that sinful persons thrive in this world. He asks also why all the endeavors, both in the respect of his professionals as a of his professions as a priest, and in the respect of the exercise of the poetic faculty, end in disappointment and failure. And he's frustrated with his life. He's frustrated with his life, and he just tells why there is a big disappointment as a poet, as a priest. The poet is trying to tell us the connection between God and man. God has a plan. God has a big plan for the mankind. But whereas man is deviating from God. That is the only reason why he is asking few questions. Why people are just the sufferers? Why I am really a disappointed man? So 1 minute.
Sorry for disturbing you. You carry on.
So close it. So he just tells why there is a big disappointment. Why there is a big disappointment as a poet. To be a priest is a really, it is a tough task, and you cannot marry, you cannot meet the people, and you have to be under the rules and regulations of the rector. Rector is a person who is in charge of the seminary, or that is called religious life. This poet, in those days, to be a priest is tough task. To be a priest is tough task. So he is expressing his feelings. He is expressing his feelings through writing, and he tells, then why my life is disappointed as a poet as well as a priest. And next paragraph, he tells, then the poet acknowledges God's love and affection for him. And being a religious poet, being a religious priest, and his heart melts like an ice. And he accepts God's presence, and he accepts God's love. Then the poet acknowledges God's love and affection for him. But even if God has been his enemy, he would not have done more to defeat the frustration of the poet's endeavor than he is doing as a friend. And he's telling, even if the God is enemy to me, definitely he would have forgot. He would have forgiven him. So God's presence is felt throughout his life. That's what he's trying. Thou art indeed just, Lord. And he just tells, what puzzles the poet is that drunkards and the lechers, that is, sinners of various kinds, spreading the whole life in the service of God. Again, the poet addresses God as Sir. And many people who are forced into religious life, but is trying to tell us that he is poor, he is very pure in his heart, is very pure in his heart. And why is the whole life is disappointing? Why his whole life is disappointing? And in the first poem, we have seen in God's grandeur, God's glory is present each and everything. But men have failed to understand his presence. Why men has failed to understand his presence? Because the people are in their own world. Today, how many of us go to temple? How many of us go to church? We are in our own world. We have our own family to look after. Many people are after construction. Many people are after earning money, and many people are in their own business. But very few, maybe 0.001% of the people just go for the praising of the creator. If there is a creator, there is a creation. That's what the line says. If there is a creation, there is a creator. So because nobody has seen the presence of God. That is only the belief. We are the creation. Who has created us? Somebody might have created us. So he is the creator. Nobody has seen the presence of God. And he's telling, in the first poem, he's trying to tell us that the God's glory is spread throughout the place, throughout the nature, but man is destroying the nature in his own activities, like industrialization. Maybe to construct many industries is destroying the nature. He has failed to understand the concept of God's glory, which is spread throughout the nature. That's what he tells. It shines like the foil of the silver. When you just put the torch on the silver, it just spreads out the light. So God's glory is like that. But many people fail to understand, and many people just fail to walk. Many people fail to walk in that particular area. So just compare to thou art indeed just a Lord. He is asking the questions after the questions to God. God, why my life is a big failure? And finally, and he just corrects himself and tells and feels God's love. And it tells the poet then acknowledges God's love and affection for him. Each and every one of us must realize the presence of God in us. If we are very, very optimistic, and if you think only the positive things in our life, the things will move on. The things will move on. The same way, we should be in a position to accept the God's glory in us. So let us see next line what he is trying to tell in Thou art indeed just, Lord. Then the poet draws the attention of God to some of the phenomena in the world of nature. Already in the middle of March, the hadaras and thickness of the everything that are shaken in the fresh wind. And it just tells God's presence can be felt, should be felt by just mingling with the nature. That's what he comes out and he just forgets himself in the midst of nature and he sees the presence of God. He sees the presence of God in nature. So that's what is it is asking questions after the other, and he just trying to find few answers to the question which he asked himself. Let us see what happens next. Next, what happens? See, and the poet is not at all happy with his life. But at the end, what happens? The poem ends in a positive, optimistic way. So God's glory, God's beauty should be felt here. God's beauty should be felt by each and every one of us. So this is two poems are over. Let us move on to Paid Beauty, and it is a beautiful poem which I love the most. It was also written in 1877. In the opening line of the poem, Hopkins says that Hopkins pays homage to God, because always remember most of his poems are in religious aspect. I can see the religious aspects in most of his poems because he cannot write about love. He doesn't know. And during the Victorian period, uh, Jim Hopkins has written main theme in his poems are God, nature, and man. So there is a clash between nature and man, but God is there to protect us. God is there to protect us, but there is a conflict between man and nature. But this particular author, G.M. Hopkins, sees God's presence in nature, but man is trying to destroy the whole nature. Maybe today we cannot see many forests today because there is a deforestation. There is a deforestation. People have cut down the trees and built their own houses. And because of the real estate business, the nature is being destroyed. For our own sake, we are destroying the beauty of nature. But whereas this particular poet, G.M. Hopkins, sees the God's glory spread throughout the nature, but we are destroying. We are unable to accept the God's beauty in the nature. So let us move on to the poem, Pied, Pied Beauty. In the opening line of the poem, the poet pays homage for God having created dappled things in this world. And he is the only author during the Victorian period where most of his poems are about God. And he just thanks God, because he should thank God, because he's a priest poet. And he knows the religion very well. He knows God very well. And that is the only reason why he tells. And he just thanks God for creating dappled things in the world. These dappled things are evidence of God's glory. Even in paid beauty, the theme of God is carried forward. Even in paid beauty, the theme of God is carried forward, and it just tells this is the evidence of God. When we just look into nature, God has created nature and with lots of beauty into it. We can see a lot of tree there during the winter season. Yeah, during winter season, even it is there in the university as well. And we can see a tree with only the flowers, not the leaves. That is the creation of God. Many people might have seen that is in pink in color. Pink in color. How many of you have seen? I don't know. Only the flowers, but leaves are very tiny, and it looks like a beautiful umbrella, pink in color. So he just sees God's presence in the beauty of nature. God then proceeds to, let us see, God then takes pleasure in paid beauty of nature, its dappled and variable appearance of God. And he just takes the pleasure in God's creation. God has created the things, but we should be in a position to accept that thing, and we should see God in nature and accept its presence and glory. The poet then proceeds to give us examples of nature's paid beauty. He first mentions the skies of the couple color, which is compared to a bridle of cow or cow on which brown color is mixed with stripes of another skin color spotted with black. So it compares the sky color with the skin of the cow, and that is the creation of God. Just think, if the cow is created only with the black color, if the cow is created with only the red color, and the beauty would not be enjoyed. If God God has the purpose in his life, and he wanted all the people to enjoy the beauty of nature. That is the only reason why he has created unique things in nature. But men have failed to understand, and men have failed to enjoy the beauty of nature. Let us move on next. Then he mentions the trout swimming with the rose-colored skin spotted with black. Next, he mentions the windfalls from chestnut trees having fallen on the ground. They break open, revealing the reddish brown net within, looking like fresh fire coal. He just describes this in this particular poem. He tries to describe the chestnut. It is in this shape like this, and when it falls from the tree and it breaks open. It is not working. I'm unable to watch anything. Am I audible to you? Can you see me, students? There is a message that I'm not able to see. It's not working. Can you hear me, students? Okay. So when that particular chestnut falls from the tree, and when it breaks open and it reveals its color inside it, it looks like a fire coal. It looks like a red color, fire in it, and that is the beauty of nature. So God has purpose in himself. God has created the things for the mankind to enjoy, but men have failed to realize the beauty of nature. Fire coal, that's what he tells. He goes on to mention the finches with their multicolored wings. And he just keeps on describing the birds as well, how God has created the beauty of nature. In fifth to sixth line of paid beauty, but there is a dappled things created by man too. Men divided the land into many plots or fields, some being used as toll enclosure for sheep, and others, and different kinds of aspects men is using, but is not utilizing, is not men is not utilizing the things created by god. But whereas here men has divided the territories into different parts, and is assuming that the whole world belongs to him. The whole world belongs to him. But whereas the God's ideology is not understood by men, and is thinking that he is going to be the boss of the universe, and he has divided the territories into various parts. That is the next. And he also divided the land into a land where agricultural can be done. Then there is a different kinds of industries with a neat, well maintained equipments, and the other things. So man is utilizing the beauty of nature for himself. But when there is a rose on the plant, the beauty of a rose can be seen and can be felt by looking at it. When you pluck the rose, when you take it home, when you keep it in the fridge or when you keep it on the table, and within few hours it fades. The petals of the rose just fades away. So that's why he is not in a position to enjoy the beauty of nature, and is trying to do more harms to nature. That is the only reason why the poet in Paid Beauty tells men has divided the territory into many parts, and he has used one part for just bringing up the sheep, and one part to cultivate the crops, and a few things where he just tells, and he has constructed industries and with lots of equipments and is well maintained. But whereas God's glory, God's vision is not understood. Why men is dividing his territory into, why men is dividing the land into many territories? Because of his own sake, because of the greediness. That's what in God's Granger he tells. Men are after money. Men are after money, and is so selfish that is unable to understand the beauty of God. It is the ego. The world is egocentric thing. Men are after the things, and that's what man-made things was God created things. There is two different things: man-made things and God created things. He is not in a position to understand why God has created so many things for mankind. That's what he says. To sum up in one sentence, G.M. Hopkins sees the presence of God in nature, but whereas man is trying to destroy the beauty of nature, but whereas G.M. Hopkins adores nature as God, but men have failed to see the things in nature, see the presence of God in nature. That's why he has constructed industries, he has divided the land into various segments, and he is egocentric, and so many things, so many elements are found in men's life. So let's move on to another thing. And it just tells the people are fickle minded. People are fickle minded, there they fail to understand the glory of God. And he just tells, I'm not, he is talking from the, a poet is talking from the Christianity point of view. And he just trying to tell us that he's not trying to prove that he's the only God. And he's trying to tell us that God has sent his only son to the world so that he can save the people from the sin. But whereas people have failed to understand his miseries on the cross. And we have heard the stories about Christ, we have read in the Bible that yes, Jesus Christ has come into the world to save the people. That is the only reason why he has shed his blood for the mankind. And Jim Hopkins, as a priest, finds God's presence everywhere. But whereas people of the world trying to avoid his presence and trying to run after so many things, running after fame, name, money, and there is an ego in his mind, and there is a fight, there is a misunderstanding, there is a dispute, there is a family dispute, and lots of things are found in men's life. So totally we can say is life of a man is in a chaotic way, chaotic, confused, whether to accept the things and whether to dispose the things. And as a poet, G.M. Hopkins indirectly or directly telling us through his poems that accept God, whoever it is, accept God and feel the glory of God in nature. Don't try to don't try to destroy the creation of God. I told you before, if there is a creator, there is a creation. Who is the creator and who is the creation? We are the creation, God is the creator. God is the creator. So we are not supposed to go against the rules and regulations of God. Even in paid beauty, or even in thou art indeed just a Lord. And there where he is asking lots of questions to God, why my life is a big failure? And even in God's Granger, the author is trying to tell us so many good aspects of the things. When you read the poem, it's like a 14 lines of poem. It's a sonnet, 14 lines of poem, octave and sestet. The first 8 lines are called octave, and next lines are called sestet. Where in the beginning of the initial beginning, starting of the poem, he comes out with a problem and with lots of questions to himself in the sestet, and he's not in an angry mood or angry tone, and he is expressing his thoughts in a simple manner, in a he's not getting angry, and he's asking lots of questions to himself. At the end he answers, and he just develops a thought in the beginning of the poem. Later he just gives us many answers to the question which he has asked himself. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you about G.M. Hopkins, and what are the things that you need to concentrate for your examination point of view. I'll tell you few of the areas where you need to concentrate. One is about the poetry of G.M. Hopkins. The probable question may be asked like this: what are the religious aspects that you can find in Hopkins' poem? One thing, what are the religious aspects? And second thing is, how being a priest poet, how does G.M. Hopkins see God's glory in nature? And next probable question is critically analysis the poem God's Grandeur and write a comparative study of G.M. Hopkins' poems, any two of the poems. You can comparatively write the answer. Next, identify the importance of influence on G.M. Hopkins as a poet, as a priest that shaped the poetic sensibility and concerns, and how being a priest poet could write or could come out with a good poetry. And what are the themes that are present in G.M. Hopkins' poem? Because he has written many poems, there are only few of the poems are prescribed to you, and you have to go through all the poems by reading only this textbook. By reading only this textbook for your examination point of view will not help you. Being a literate student, you should enjoy the real piece of writing. Take out or take the printout of the poem. It is only a 14 lines of poem. Read the poem twice or thrice. Read the poem between the lines. And what the author or what the poet is trying to tell us. And what are the things that he wants us to accept in our life? What are the things that he wants us to accept in our life? And he is always a positive, optimistic poet where he's trying to tell us that see the things, see the God's glory in the nature. That's what in Paid Beauty also, Windover also we can see. We can see in the strengthness of falcon, and you can see how this bird can take the aerial route and hover and hover, hover and hover in the sky and try to come down. So we should have that perspective in our life, and we should accept God. We should see nature as our mother, and don't try to harm the nature. Don't try to move away from the presence of God. And he's trying to tell us through this poem that we should be obedient people to God. So these are the things, these are the areas where you need to concentrate. And then one more thing is, 1 minute, let me open. How does Paid Beauty is a perfect example of Scottish influence of Hopkins, and is influenced. As I told you before, he belongs to SJ, Society of Jesus, and they don't have any parish as such. They are into religious life. Religious life in the sense people have to move from one place to the another place. Maybe if you are in Bombay, 1 year, 2 years serving the people, next year you will be transferred to some other place. So there is no fixed place for him. So the sole purpose of Society of Jesus, the founded by Ignatius Loyola is people being a priest, you should serve the mankind. Through Hopkins, we get the message that we must feel the presence of God through nature. So these are the areas, students, you need to concentrate and try to read the real text. Don't try to read the summary from the internet or the study material which is provided to you. Just keep the dictionary with you and find out the different difficult meanings of the poem. And there is a background to all the poem. And James Hopkins being a priest, and he has all the things uh, which he has worked out before, and he has no idea, he has no intention that his poems should be published. And that's what he told to his friend Robert. And if my poems are helpful to the people, let it be published after my death. So Jim Hopkins died in the year 1889, June 8th, and after his death, and all the poems are published with the permission of the superiors, that is, the rector of Society of Jesus, and it was published. So most of his poems are rich in religious aspects, and we can see he is the first person, is regarded as the innovator of the modern verse in English. And we can find a strong element of Christian sensibility throughout his poem. And God's Grandeur is a hymn to the greatness of God. The poem expresses Hopkins' concern for preserving nature. That's what he's telling us. Don't try to harm the nature. See God in nature. So these are the areas where you need to concentrate. So students, tomorrow when we come back, and I will be discussing with you another text. This is the poem which I want to discuss with you. I have discussed. And tomorrow when we come back, and tomorrow I'm going to discuss with you another good text for you. And please read it yourself. The name of the text as well. I'm not going to tell you now. Tomorrow I'm going to tell. And even when you approach a novel or a drama, don't read only the summary, the act-wise summary. Try to understand what is the plot, and who is the protagonist, and what is his relationship with the other characters. Then only you will understand each and every scene should be read out, should not be omitted. So there is a link between each and every scene. In first act, or in the first scene, in the opening lines of the novel, we can see the protagonist is fighting with someone else. So that should be kept in your mind, because there is a interlink, there is a connection between the first act or the second act or the third scene or the fourth scene. So if you keep the plot and the characters in your mind and the themes of the play or the novel, then you will be able to write a good answer in your examination. Thank you, students. Since it is the last class of the day, tomorrow I'm going to be discussing with you another text. Thank you, everyone. Is there any questions you can ask me? Do you have a question to ask me? Please ask. Students, do you have a question to ask? You can ask me. Otherwise, we will continue tomorrow, and we shall discuss another good text. Thank you, students.